Hello, my name is Austin Habish, the founder of Think Catholic, and you're listening to the Summa podcast, where we study St. Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologiae in a way simple and insightful for anyone to understand. The Summa podcast is brought to you by Think Catholic. Taking 2 questions of the Summa a day, we'll seek to summarize St. Thomas's responses, discovering the brilliance of Aquinas and his Catholic faith. This is day 208. So let's get started. We're covering today questions 180 and 181 of the Secundae, that is, of the contemplative life and of the active life. The translation that I always use in these podcasts is the one generously provided to me by Ave Maria Press, the 5-volume set translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican province, which you can now get at a discounted price from Ave Maria Press's site by typing in the code SUMMA10, and so here we go. Article 1, whether the contemplative life has nothing to do with the affections and pertains wholly to the intellect. The will follows after the intellect. It is called the intellectual appetite, which we understand from experience, since one cannot love what one doesn't first know. And when we know something to be good, then a love for that same thing naturally follows. So one cannot just contemplate God without falling in love with God, being ignited in the heart to serve and live for Him, unless, of course, one has vices which skew either knowledge of God or affection for God. However, for those with a peaceful conscience and a right understanding of God, the thought of God inflames the heart. As it is written in Psalm 39, "My heart grew hot within me, and during my meditation a fire would flare up." So the contemplative life has to do with both the intellect and the affections, as St. Thomas teaches here. From the very fact that truth is the end of contemplation, it has the aspect of appetible good, both lovable and delightful, and in this respect it pertains to the appetitive power. Article 2, whether the moral virtues pertain to the contemplative life. They do for the reason we have already mentioned, that vices skew both reason and appetite, our judgments and our loves. The man who has set his heart on temporal things cannot love God correctly, and likely will not even have the desire to think about God, because to him God is not a loving friend, a faithful father, but a just judge, whom this hypothetical person has offended and is anticipating to receive eternal damnation at the hands of. In Aquinas' words, the act of contemplation wherein the contemplative life essentially consists is hindered both by the impetuosity of the passions, which withdraw the soul's intention from intelligible to sensible things, and by outward disturbances. Now the moral virtues curb the impetuosity of the passions and quell the disturbances of outward occupations. Hence moral virtues belong dispositively, so by disposing the man, to the contemplative life. Article 3, whether there are various actions pertaining to the contemplative life. The one action which gives unity and identity to the contemplative life is the contemplation of God. However, unlike the angels who, when they know a thing, a particular truth, idea, form, they know it completely, human beings don't possess this perfection of the mind, but we have to learn about things progressively. We have to abstract first knowledge from sense data, then once we arrive at the gist of the thing, like what a pine tree is, then we have to go on to make further judgments about it and further reason regarding what its accidental attributes are. And so the contemplative life includes these acts as well, everything from simple apprehension to judgment to reasoning. As St. Thomas says here, accordingly then the contemplative life has one act wherein it is finally completed, namely the contemplation of truth. Yet it has many acts whereby it arrives at this final act. Some of these pertain to the reception of principles, from which it proceeds to the contemplation of truth. Others are concerned with deducing from the principles the truth, the knowledge of which is sought. And the last and crowning act is the contemplation itself of the truth. Article 4, whether the contemplative life consists in the mere contemplation of God or also in the consideration of any truth whatsoever. By the effects of God we see in the natural world, along with the particular truths abstracted from it, we are more easily able to rise to the contemplation of the principle of the natural world, which is God. As St. Paul said in the letter to the Romans, "For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. Ever since the creation of the world, his invisible nature, namely his eternal power and deity, have been clearly perceived in the things that have been made." So the contemplative life consists essentially in the contemplation of God, secondarily in considering those truths which assist us in contemplating God, and positively the contemplative life concerns moral virtues, without which one is unable to have the peace of mind and desire requisite to contemplate God. Article 5, whether in the present state of life the contemplative life can reach to the vision of the divine essence. Since God said, as recorded in the book of Exodus, "Man shall not see me and live," St. Augustine then explains and responds to our article by saying, "No one seeing God lives this mortal life wherein the bodily senses have their play, and unless in some way he depart this life, whether by going altogether out of his body or by withdrawing from his carnal senses, he is not caught up into that vision." This was the experience of rapture which St. Paul experienced, and we described a couple episodes ago. A man, even in this life, can be caught up to the third heaven, as St. Paul was, and see the divine essence, not because they possess the habit of the light of glory, which enables them to see God in an abiding way and is in the blessed in heaven, but because such a light can be granted in a passing way. It is in this way that a man in this present life can reach to the vision of God. Article 6, whether the operation of contemplation is fittingly divided into a threefold movement, circular, straight, and oblique. If one is resting in the contemplation of a single aspect, truth concerning God, this is considered a kind of circular contemplation, like the earth simply orbits around the one sun of our solar system. If one then move to another point of consideration, this will be called a straight movement in his or her contemplation. A mixture of these two movements, holding in contemplation, then moving to another point, will be called a movement which is oblique. By this process, we move higher and higher in the contemplation of God through a kind of spiral of thought upwards towards deeper, simpler, and by God's grace, supernatural knowledge of Him. And for more on contemplation, specifically infused contemplation, see the work Ascent of Mount Carmel by St. John of the Cross and The Science of the Cross by St. Teresa Benedicta of the Cross. Article 7, whether there is delight in contemplation. Joy comes from the perceived good as possessed. And since God is the greatest good, possession of Him in the mind through contemplation of Him not only elicits delight, but the greatest delight possible in this life. Because it is an intellectual delight, which is greater than sensual delights or pleasures, and because it is being elicited by the possession of the greatest good, which is God. Lastly, since the greater we love a thing or person, the more we will delight in their presence and conversation, then also on account of charity, the supernatural, habitual love of God, contemplation elicits great delight, and the greater the charity, the greater that delight will be both now and in eternity. In St. Thomas's words, the delight thereof of contemplation surpasses all human delight, both because spiritual delight is greater than carnal pleasure, and because the love whereby God is loved out of charity surpasses all love. Hence it is written, "O taste and see that the Lord is sweet." That's Psalm 33, verse 9. Article 8, whether the contemplative life is continuous. The contemplative life, the contemplation of God, will continue from this life to the life to come, because what is being contemplated is imperishable, that's God, along with the faculty which is doing the contemplating, which is the intellect, a faculty of the soul. Thus the contemplative life for man will continue. As it is taught here in the article, our Lord said in the Gospel of Luke, "Mary hath chosen the best part, which shall not be taken away from her." Since, as Gregory says, the contemplative life begins here, so that it may be perfected in our heavenly home. We move then on to question 181 of the active life. Article 1, whether all the actions of the moral virtues pertain to the active life. And the chief of the moral virtues is justice, by which one man is directed in his relations towards another, St. Thomas says here. And since the other principal virtues of the appetite, temperance and fortitude, along with all their annexed parts, are for the sake of justice, and justice is about rendering to the other their due, then the moral virtues pertain especially to the active life, to the life of those focused on particular acts of service in the world. As St. Thomas puts it here, now it is evident that the moral virtues are directed chiefly not to the contemplation of truth, but to operation. Hence it is clear that the moral virtues belong essentially to the active life. Article 2, whether prudence pertains to the active life. Prudence is our virtue of right reason as directed towards action. It is the virtue directing us to the correct means as ordered to the goal set by the moral virtues, by justice especially. And since prudence assists the ends of the moral virtues, which are directed especially to action, then prudence can be said to pertain to the active life. Article 3, whether teaching is a work of the active or of the contemplative life. As answered briefly by St. Thomas, one object of teaching is the matter or object of the interior concept. And as to this object, teaching belongs sometimes to the active, sometimes to the contemplative life. It belongs to the active life when a man conceives a truth inwardly so as to be directed thereby in his outward action. But it belongs to the contemplative life when a man conceives an intelligible truth in the consideration and love whereof he delights. The other object of teaching is on the part of speech, heard, and thus the object of teaching is the hearer. As to this object, all doctrine belongs to the active life to which external actions pertain. And now Article 4, our last article, whether the active life remains after this life. We will not engage in active works of mercy in the life to come, like teaching or feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, and such, but will take part in that eternal, tranquil activity of thinking about and loving God. And if we are engaged then in intercessory prayer for the living, even this will not be an obstacle to our contemplation, similar to how the angels are absorbed or engrossed in the thought of God, while all the while assisting mankind here. To this point, St. Thomas says, in regard to the angels, as Gregory remarks, they do not wander abroad from the divine vision, so as to be deprived of the joys of inward contemplation. Hence in them the active life does not differ from the contemplative life, as it does in us, for whom the works of the active life are a hindrance to contemplation. In other words, in heaven the active life as we experience it here will come to a definitive end. Which brings us to the close of another episode. We have just finished covering questions 180 and 181 of the Secunda Secundae, that is, of the contemplative life and of the active life. My name is Austin Habish with Think Catholic, and I cannot wait to see you tomorrow.